here's the general plan of attack for this. We've got a lot of stuff we need to finish up. So first, I want to say a little bit about the parameters for in vitro fertilization. I think that can be done, but within some fairly tight parameters. Okay. Second, I want to say a little bit about surrogacy. Surrogacy is very controversial, and this is the law is just now catching up to the second wave of surrogacy. It took a really long time for the law to catch up to the first wave. Now what's happening is we're seeing a lot more surrogacy relationships among gay couples, particularly pairs of gay men. And so even when it's used by lesbians too, it's really interesting to watch how the courts are assigning the custody of children when these couples split. And I've been watching, I haven't seen one quite come down the pike yet that fits everything I'm looking for, but I want to see if the courts handle surrogacy among same-sex couples the way they do among opposite-sex couples. Anyway, that's just something to watch. But we'll say a little bit about surrogacy. As we mentioned last time, I think the surrogacy case that I told you guys about constitutes a legitimate exception to a general sort of negative view of surrogacy because it conflicts with other important values. Okay? Then third, if there's interest, we don't have to do this, but if there's interest, say a little bit about the Catholic view on this. I take it that that's among our group here, it's not a widely held view, so if we don't need to go down that road, we won't. And then finally, I'd like to say a little bit about what some of the things that I see coming that are on the fringes that make for really interesting discussion, and they always get on the front page of the newspaper. And some of them are becoming a lot more mainstream. So things like posthumous procreation and artificial wombs, some of the things that we're able to do to keep people alive just to continue a pregnancy, things like that. Okay, we've already said that that IVF, when using the genetic materials of husband and wife, fits within our general biblical and theological parameters, right? But that's only the beginning of the story with IVF, because now let's imagine that the couple you're counseling has decided to go that direction, right? And my guess is that most couples who start down this road are not, if they're made aware of them, they're probably not paying close attention to the potential moral obstacles that await them. It'd be very interesting to take a poll in your church of couples who have had IVF done and ask them, how they went about it. My guess is that most couples today who have twins or more so for triplets, it is really hard to do triplets naturally. Triplets are almost always today the result of IVF or some form of reproductive technology. Okay? Twins, not so much, but that's my guess. That's probably a 50-50 thing. Okay? Now, the first thing the couple has to be aware of is not only the probability, but the likelihood of having embryos left over if they have a successful pregnancy. Okay? The way IVF is done is in order to maximize the number of embryos that you create in the lab. You guys all understand the reason for that? Okay, just in a sentence or two. Because the reason is because if you get to the end of the line and don't become pregnant, it's much more cost effective and it's much easier on the woman's body to just thaw out additional embryos that you have in storage as opposed to starting the process all over again. Right? Now, we keep being told that the infertility industry is getting better and better at freezing eggs instead of embryos. Actually, freezing eggs is not really the problem. Thawing them out is the problem. Once that becomes more mainstream, then this will be a moot point. We won't really have anything to talk about because the woman will can store the eggs and thaw them out and fertilize them a few at a time. Okay? Now, today, infertility clinics offer to women, let's say, God forbid, that you get cancer. Do you have children? Okay. Let's go back, turn the clock back to before you had children. You got cancer, and chemotherapy was required, which basically, chemotherapy brings on menopause immediately. And so your childbearing days would have been over by virtue of saving your life. Right? But what you could have done is had a harvest of eggs removed and kept and frozen and kept in storage for the time that you recover and you're ready to have a family again. Right? Now, again, the difficulty is in thawing them out, and the industry is getting better and better at that. And I think the last time I checked on this, it was far enough along to where we're at a place where it's not inappropriate for couples to ask about that possibility. Now, it will likely cost more to do it that way. But that has a better chance of not having embryos left over. Right? Now, what the clinic will probably tell you is that the retrieval rate, the rate at which eggs are successfully thawed out, is very low, and so you're risking spending a lot of money putting eggs in storage and not having much to show for it when it comes time to thaw them out. And to date, embryos thaw out much, much better than eggs do. Sperm have no trouble freezing and thawing, which I'm not exactly sure what accounts for that difference. Okay, so just be aware of that. The normal way IVF clinics will do this is to give you the hormones that will enable the woman to release as many eggs as possible in one cycle. Right? You have to harvest them all. Right? Now I suppose you could discard some of the eggs up front, but I'm not sure that doesn't make a lot of sense. Because when you put the eggs and sperm together in the Petri dish, it's completely unpredictable how many will successfully fertilize. There is just no way to predict that. Right? So usually there's 40 to 50% attrition, if not more, which is roughly the same number of conceptions that actually miscarry naturally. Right? So the couple just they need to know what they're getting into. And they need a good exit strategy for what to do with embryos if they have them left over. Okay, now we already said, what are the moral options for them with leftover embryos? What are they?
Adoption.
Okay, put them up for adoption. Okay. Carry them to term yourself. What else?
Long-term storage.
Right. Okay. That's a temporary moral option.
Has to be dealt
Okay.
with
Eventually, yeah. Interesting part of this, no charge for this, but it's really interesting to watch how many couples are so ambivalent about making a decision. And a lot of them, they'll pay the storage fee for some time, and then they'll just quit paying the fee because they don't want to make a decision. Which puts the clinic, of course, in an awful position of having either to do something with the embryos or continue to store them at their own expense. Right? The general principle, it seems to me, that couples have to be committed to going into IVF is that you don't discard embryos. That every embryo you create in the lab deserves an opportunity to mature in the womb. Now, you can put them up for adoption, but just the couple needs to know that emotionally there's a big difference between putting one newborn that you can't handle up for adoption and putting, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 of your children in embryonic form up for adoption. Right? That's different. Right? So I'd be really, and here's the thing. If the couple doesn't, if you can tell that they don't have the stomach for this, for dealing with the embryos that they create and taking responsibility for them, then I would advise them not to go down that road. Yeah.
Can the clinics control how many embryos they fertilize? I mean, can they say, we just want 2, we just want 3 embryos fertilized? They don't have a way to control that?
No, they don't, because, just as when a couple's trying naturally to have children, you never know if conception is going to happen naturally, even if you're right in that window period. There's no way to predict how many embryos will fertilize successfully. Now, I have heard of some clinics that will taper down the amount of hormones that they give to the woman so that she releases fewer eggs than she otherwise might. But what I would suggest to couples is make your values known up front. Okay? Now, I think I mentioned to you guys last time that some clinics offer a money-back guarantee. Okay? And if you choose that option, you lose the ability to set parameters on it. Because you only get that guarantee under maximal conditions for the clinic. Okay? All right? This is potentially a very sticky wicket for couples. Yes.
So we're in agreement. There really are only 2 options as to what to do with the leftover embryo.
Long term, yes.
Right.
Short term, no. Storage, I think, is an option short term.
Right.
But that's just postponing another decision that has to be made.
Okay.
That's right. Okay, we all clear on that? Any questions? Any other questions on that? Okay, now the other potential landmine for couples on this is one that's easily avoidable. Okay, and that is the prospect of selective termination of pregnancies if she gets pregnant with more than she can safely carry, or than the couple wants to raise. My friends, who I described in the book, who had triplets from Gift, and he was telling me while his wife was pregnant with the triplets, he had had a conversation with a coworker whose wife who they'd had IVF done, and they were talking about how the clinic had offered, both of them, the prospect of reducing the number of pregnancies, which is another euphemism for aborting your children. Okay? And I remember he described the conversation, and his coworker actually didn't think much of it. And so my friend actually said, I can't imagine, I look at my kids today, I can't imagine making that decision about one of my children. And for some reason, his coworker had never quite thought of it in those terms. It was still in such clinical terms that these were embryos, not his children. And couples got to see them as, what we said before, that location doesn't matter in terms of what kind of a thing this embryo is. Okay? So the way to fix this is just do not authorize the clinic to implant more than either you can safely carry or are prepared to raise. In other words, the octomom scenario is always avoidable. Okay? Now, for somebody who's, my wife is very petite. She's about 5'2", maybe soaking wet is over 100 pounds. But for her to carry more than 2 would have been, I think, very unwise. Because it wouldn't have been long before, she just was going to run out of real estate in there for these embryos to exercise their squatters' rights. Now, some women who are a little bit bigger framed maybe can take 3. I have heard of 4 and 5 being delivered successfully. Actually, we had a Talbot student here a couple years ago whose sister gave birth to 6. In fact, she nearly died because, in fact, her heart nearly gave out, and understandably so, from having to support all this stuff. And so just that was probably 3. So she's probably got 6 kids under 3 in the house. So that's a world-class number of diapers and bottles to be going through. My friend, when they had their triplets, said they went through 200 diapers a week and 150 bottles a week. Not very much. Not very much. Those are great kids, so they're all. Now he's paying college tuition for 3 of them this year for the first time. Okay, so now I just don't authorize implanting more than you're prepared to live with. Okay, now couples are really unaware of this. This is where you can be very helpful. Sometimes with intrauterine insemination, something as simple as artificial insemination, couples sometimes want to take a shortcut around IVF. And so what is done sometimes is that the woman will be given the hormones to release the eggs, but instead of harvesting them and fertilizing them in the lab and reimplanting some and storing the rest, what they'll do is after the eggs are released, they'll do artificial insemination. Okay? So if you just put the pencil to this and do the math, you have the possibility of 5, 8, 10, 12, 15 or more eggs being released, and at the same time, a couple million sperm joining the party. And you can see the possibility for something disastrous. A litter, yeah. And this is, originally when I first heard about Octomom, this was what I thought what counted for it. Turned out that was not the case. Hers was a case of IVF where they actually implanted 6 and 2 of them split early in the pregnancy that gave her a total of 8. And it was about time, in my view, about time that the physician who implanted those 6 was censured for that. But Octomom, to her credit, and this didn't get a lot of publicity, to her credit, refused selective termination. Right? Now, I would never have authorized putting that many in the first place. And
Do they usually put in that many and then selectively terminate?
it depends on the age of the woman. The older she is, the more they tend to implant. And there's I would never implant more than 3, regardless. Implanting, 5 or 6, I think is almost the same as selectively terminating some, because you know that you're going to lose some. In my view, that's the equivalent of putting more people in a lifeboat that can actually survive on it. Okay? Now, so just be really careful. Even when couples talk about artificial insemination, you have to ask them, are you doing this in conjunction with, the what are called the multiple ovulation hormones? Okay? Because and to be fair, a lot of infertility physicians will not do that combination of the hormones plus artificial insemination unless the woman agrees in advance to selectively reduce the number of pregnancies if she gets in a danger zone. Okay? Now, I would never agree to that in advance, for one, and I would never combine, this first half of IVF with artificial insemination. And I think you're asking for a disastrous situation. And it's very clear, at least it's clear to me, that God did not intend women to carry litters of children. It's very hazardous to their health and to the health of the children. Because I think that gal that carried 6, they were born at least 3 months prematurely.
This is something stirring in me. This is kind of bothering me.
There should be a lot that's bothering you about this.
We're coming along with technology, and it's disastrous, and God doesn't intend a lot, but we can help Him make a few. And I'm like,
well, I understand. Almost all technologies under the curse of sin are mixed. Right? Even something like electricity, can be. If it's out of control, can electrocute people. This one, I think, just happens to be a little bit more mixed than others. And so I think what that means, not necessarily that we have to say no to it, but we just have to think really carefully about what's required in order to use it. Okay? Now it may be, again, and if the couple has to decide if they want to do this under these parameters. And I would encourage them not to forge ahead and ignore these things, which most of them do, right? Because they're not aware of them, or the desire for a baby trumps everything. Or they can proceed cautiously, and go for it, or they can decide, to do this under these conditions. We just don't have the stomach for that. Like most couples, I think, they really don't want to entertain the prospect of putting leftover embryos up for adoption. And they really don't want to think about, after they've had triplets, going another round if they have embryos left over. That's what I mean. If you don't have the stomach for those options, then you shouldn't do this.
When you said earlier about when you start putting things in technological language, people don't really, and it just, in a lot of ways, it seems like once you go down the road of technology, I mean, it seems like there's very, very few people who can really think through this morally, ethically. It just seems like a Pandora's box.
Well, it is a huge Pandora's box, but I'm not sure.
Open it.
I'm not sure the answer is not to open it.
Yeah, that's
Because I think it's manageable. It's complicated, no doubt, but it is manageable. Right? Here's the thing: if you minister to young families, somewhere they have to be aware that these are potential landmines that are waiting for them. Okay? I assure you, the clinic is not going to tell them. Or at least the clinic is not going to present this in a moral framework. Right? Now they'll tell you that they'll disclose that you can have embryos left over and here's a storage thing. But they'll treat that generally as just a fact. And of course people throw away embryos, they're just clumps of cells anyway. And of course people selectively end pregnancies if they have to, because you don't want the woman to die or the children to be compromised. But it's not that simple. Hey, amen? We all clear on this? Or is that clear? It's clear as mud. Huh?
I may be asking a question that would open up something we don't have time for, but it has bothered me
go
for
for
a
it.
while. Has there been any research on the health, emotionally and physically, of the children who are born through all of this? And one of the reasons I'm asking is I know a man who is one of the first test tube babies in the United States. Very strange. I mean, intellectually, he's great, but emotionally, relationally, really weird. So,
The only research, the only thing I'm aware of, they have done a bit of study on whether the incidence of birth defects is higher. But for what you're referring to, that's a kind of a nature versus nurture thing that's a little harder to sort out.
And I'm wondering, with the increase in autism, diagnosed autism, or the increase in infertility, it's making me wonder, is there something connected?
I say if there is, it's not well publicized. There's been, like I say, some discussion of birth defects, but it's probably not enough to be concerned about. Now with the donor children, that's a different matter, right? And we got good data on that. Okay. Can we leave this? Okay. All right. Let's turn to something that actually is a bit more complicated. I'm not. I wish I were kidding, but it's not. Surrogacy. With traditional or genetic surrogacy, I don't think there's much debate over whether that constitutes the purchase and sale of children. The courts have ruled that it does. Most states that have laws on this have laws prohibiting both genetic surrogacy and the purchase and sale of children. Okay? Because it's not hard, I think, to get your arms around that one, Because if the woman contributes the egg and gives birth to the child, by most people's definition, she's the mother. And if she chooses to give up the child, she does so with the full knowledge that it's hers to give. And if she does so, in exchange, she signs away her parental rights, in exchange for cash, that's not a tough call to make that constitutes baby selling. Right? And the reason baby selling is illegal, in my view, rightly so, is that it's an implication of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution that prohibited slavery. That human beings have intrinsic dignity that makes them something fundamentally different than market commodities. Okay? Now that one I don't think is all that tough. Right? And early on, because when surrogacy got started, IVF was less than 10 years old. I mean, the first IVF case was in 1975. And the first surrogacy cases coming out of this were in the early 80s. The Baby M case, I think, was the one that was a TV miniseries, was in 1985. And so it was a lot simpler, and plus IVF was just not as widely available as it is today. So the genetic surrogacy was really how the thing got started, right? Because technologically it was actually pretty simple, where you would take, the husband's sperm and artificially inseminate the surrogate. End of story. Right? Unless the surrogate wanted to keep the child, then all hell broke loose. Right? Which is why today and the law was structured to protect the rights of the surrogate as the mother. Right? Which is why today most surrogacies are not genetic surrogacies. The majority of them today are gestational surrogacies. Okay? And even if it would be much more convenient and less costly to do a genetic surrogacy, most clinics don't advise that because of the legal risk should the surrogate want to keep the child. Now, the number of genetic or gestational surrogacies that are also outsourced, those are mostly gestational surrogacies too. Okay?
Dr. Ray?
Yes.
For a lot of the gestational surrogacy cases, usually the couple that wants the baby is usually the wife. She can't go through a pregnancy. Is that
Right.
what it
That
is?
she can produce eggs, but can't carry the child to term. Right. Right. And it may be that. Sometimes even if she can carry the child, they'll choose a surrogate. Sometimes it's kind of unusual, but and even couples for whom a genetic surrogacy would have been, less cumbersome and less costly, they will choose the gestational one generally. Right? Right? Now we're all aware of what's involved in that. It's you harvest the woman's eggs, of the married couple, right? And they're fertilized in the lab with the husband's sperm and then implanted in a gestational surrogate, okay, who has no genetic connection then to the child. And the definition, if there's a dispute over who gets the child, the definition of the mother here gets just hopelessly complicated. Okay? Because now you've split the biological components of motherhood into two. Because you've got one woman with the genetic contribution and another woman who's carrying the child and giving birth to to the child. Now, the way the law treats this is essentially like this, that the biological contributions cancel each other out. And so what breaks the tie is what I would call the preconception intent to parent the child, which will tip the balance in favor of the couple and away from the surrogate. Okay? So by signing that contract, the woman who gives the eggs is expressing her intention to be the parent of that child. And the courts have ruled that when biology is split, that's the trump card. Okay? And that's the thing that decides it. Okay? And the landmark case on this was right here in Orange County in 1990 that has set the precedent for gestational surrogacy. Okay? Now, just so you're aware, some states don't make a distinction and prohibit all of it. But some states that have laws on this do make a difference, which in gestational surrogacy, the surrogate basically has no rights to the child. And so if she wants to keep the child, too bad. Is the way the law treats it. Now, I think you can make a good argument for both genetics and gestation being the determinant of motherhood. Genetics is obviously a very powerful influence on who the child becomes. But I think the way I described this in the reading, I love the way one writer puts this, the surrogate's sweat equity in the child by the time she gives birth, I think counts for a lot too. Because she's the one who's got the connection, the bonding, the relationship. And we know that what goes on in the womb is a lot more than just nutrition and shelter. What goes on in the womb shapes the personality, the emotional life of the child also, which I think is probably one thing that gave rise to your question, which is the other reason that things like artificial wombs may be a really lousy way to gestate children, because you don't have that. Okay? So anyway, I don't, we're not going to resolve that here. If I had to vote, I would vote for the surrogate and gestation being a more significant determinant than genetics. And I think the intent, the problem with the intent part is that the surrogate, if she develops the intent to parent the child, that's based on a real connection, a real bonding, real relationship with the child. But that's definitely not a hill that I'm prepared to die on. Yeah.
So if the couple comes to us and we're the pastor and says, hey, we want to do gestational surrogacy, what do we advise?
Well, I'd say it depends on the circumstance. Because remember we talked about this couple? We talked about this couple? Remember we were addressing them last time? I think that was okay in this situation because they really had no other option for the leftover embryo. Right? I mean, they could have given them up for adoption, but that seems sort of silly because they wanted to raise the children themselves. I think in most cases where it doesn't conflict with another moral value, I think having a surrogate violates the biblical norm of procreation take place within the context of marriage. And so I would say the default position would be to say, I'll pass on donors and pass on surrogates, which I think leaves us, within those parameters, the technologies that utilize the genetic materials of husband and wife. And for couples that need donors, I would really encourage you guys to suggest that they adopt embryos instead. Because, think about this. This is not to say, this is not a ding on traditional adoption. I think there are two advantages over embryo adoption. One is there's continuity between gestation and rearing. So the same woman that gives birth to the child, you don't sever that relationship at birth. And here's the other one. What's the biggest fear that adoptive couples have? When the birth mother coming back to reclaim the child. And somebody was telling me the other day that some states allow up to a year, which in my view is unconscionable. I think in California it's 30 days in California, if I remember right, 30 to 60 days, something like that, which I think is much more reasonable. But with adopting embryos, the chances that the genetic contributors are going to come back and, quote, reclaim their children is very, very low. Because by virtue of putting the embryos up for adoption, they've already said, we're done having children. Now, not to say that couldn't happen, but unlikely, it seems to me. Okay? Well, yeah. Go, Joe.
I'm a bit confused because if you can start to go down the road of technology and you end up here with some extra embryos, but then in this case you're bringing in surrogacy as an option, which I thought was, if you started there outside of the one flesh union.
But you're not by giving them up for adoption, you're not necessarily going down. You're really not going down the road of surrogacy. You're just donating it to another couple where the wife will gestate and bear the children. Only when the couple wants to raise their children but is medically unable, that a surrogate would be appropriate. Because you've got a conflict with other moral values. Right? You got the third party norm, but you've also got the sanctity of life, where you don't want to discard embryos. And I would say for a couple that actually wants to raise their own children, it'd be pointless to put them up for adoption. It'd be better if they raised those children themselves. But if they're medically unable, and the only way they can do that is with a surrogate, then I think basically only in those circumstances would I say it's okay. But it's because there's a conflict with another moral value. Yes.
Oh, I was just going to ask a question. So, if the couple can only one of either the husband or the wife can provide genetic material, and they're saying, well, can we do IVF and get a donor? And you would say, no, let's encourage them to do embryo adoption. You're basically telling them, though, that the one person that can contribute, that he's not going to be able to contribute to the child.
That would be part of the cost. Yeah. Right. So the couple would have to be okay with embryo adoption over, basically a half of a genetic connection.
So in the same situation, if they didn't have 5
If we were
Yes.
yeah, right. If we were starting from scratch, I wouldn't involve a surrogate. Yeah. And I think dealing with dealing with the hand you're dealt is different than starting from scratch on it. Okay, well, can we leave that? Okay. Now, let me give you just a couple things that are coming or that are on the fringe. We'll talk about cloning human beings in the next segment, but somebody's going to do that eventually. It was just a thing in the paper. I think, didn't you send this to me? One of you guys sent this to me about, it's in the New York Times, about about therapeutic cloning working, and we've got, we have identical twins produced for stem cell harvest, and that's been much more successful. Okay. Now, whether it will go, whether it can go the full 9 months of pregnancy is still technologically to be determined, but my guess is within our lifetime that's going to happen. And we'll talk more about the morality of that. Artificial wombs, we've spent some time talking about that. Right? Did we talk about that related to abortion? Enough? Okay. It is possible for aborted fetuses actually to be egg donors, because at about 6 months gestation, maybe earlier than that, somewhere in the second trimester, female fetuses have all of their eggs. They just need to mature one at a time. But you can actually harvest eggs from aborted fetuses. So you could actually have an egg donor be an aborted fetus. Right? Now, thankfully, this first was done in Britain. Thankfully, the Brits put a moratorium on this, but there's no reason we can't technologically do this. We'll talk about gender selection a little bit next time. There are 3 different ways to do this, one of which does not involve aborting fetuses or throwing away embryos. It involves sorting sperm, and it's done prior to conception, which some of you, I take it, will be writing on that. We'll talk a little bit more next time about designer children, where you can select. You really should hunt around on the internet on this. It's very revealing. It's also a little depressing how you can choose the traits of your donors that will, come together to produce, quote, your child. We're still quite a long way from doing anything more than just, choosing the traits of the donors and putting them together. That's going to be a ways away. We are through egg donation and hormone therapy, we now are able to have postmenopausal women bear children. The oldest one I'm aware of on record is a 63-year-old woman who bore a child. The clinic that's associated with USC Medical Center places a limit of age 50. They won't take anybody over 50 as a potential client. But what they found is that women, not a huge surprise in this here, women lie about their age sometimes. Shocking, isn't it? And so they've had a lot of trouble enforcing that limit. There are a lot of people who are asking questions if that's good, if that's good for children. And then after a woman has died, we can continue to keep. In fact, I consulted on a case where a woman who's in a persistent vegetative state was 7.5 months pregnant, and her husband really wanted to keep her going long enough to deliver the child. And usually if they're in the 3rd trimester, you can do that. In the 1st trimester, generally they don't encourage that, but the 2nd trimester is a little bit of a gray area. And then I actually consulted on a case too of, in a Catholic hospital of all places, of posthumous procreation, where the organ donation team that was called in, it's about a 35-year-old gentleman, I forget his name, but part of the facts was he was a fairly well-known professional football player. And his estranged wife, he was killed in an automobile accident, and his estranged wife came in literally, 4 o'clock in the morning when they were donating his organs and asked for his sperm. And so the guy's father, who was authorizing the organ donation, didn't know quite what to make of that and said, well, okay. And she took, a test tube of his sperm, which they had harvested from a dead body, which we can do, within the first probably 24 hours. And what she did with it, we never found out, but our speculation was that she wanted access to his estate by basically burying his child. And so we actually, our ethics committee took this up. We actually wrote a letter to the legislature suggesting that this practice be outlawed, if not substantially regulated, because in our view, this put the deceased person in the position of becoming a parent, likely against his will. Since for most people, the good of parenting is actually being around to actually parent the child. And so we also had some pretty harsh words for the organ procurement people who didn't realize that in a Catholic hospital that doesn't separate the unitive and procreative aspects of sex, that we would be facilitating posthumous procreation in a Catholic hospital. That just that went right over people's heads, that might be a problem in a Catholic hospital. So, but we can do this, and again, you have not lots, but some people think that's a pretty good idea to be able to do that. Yeah.
Is there any studies or information on somebody that's in a vegetative state, if that has an effect on the child in the womb?
No, not that I'm aware of. What you have to do is, you also have to supply the hormones and the rest of the, it's not just food and water that has to be supplied. There's a little more to it than that. It's a little bit more complicated. But anyway, this is some of the things that are on the edge of things to be looking for. If you want to read a little bit more about this, I would encourage you. There's 2 places this is available. I'll give you the shorthand. The first of these are 2 Catholic encyclicals that you can just Google on the web under Humana Vitae, on human life. And then 1987, the follow-up to this, Donum Vitae. This one is more on abortion and birth control. This one is on technologically assisted reproduction. This quote is from Donum Vitae. And these are the two sort of non-negotiable components where the Catholic view essentially argues this, that God designed, or God ordained in creation to be an unbreakable continuity between marriage, sexual relations, procreation, and parenting. Okay? And again, the exception to that would be adoption. But I think, the Catholic view would also agree that adoption is not procreation. Okay? Now, to take it a little bit further, their view is that the way God ordained sexual relations is that there is an inseparable connection between the unitive and procreative aspects of sex. Right? Now, what that means is that every time a couple comes together in marriage, there has to be an openness to procreation. You don't have to intend procreation, but there has to be an openness to procreation. The Catholic view, I think, would argue that if you remove procreation from the loving embrace of a married couple, you're actually doing something different than procreating. They would say that you've actually changed the nature of what you're doing. As they would say procreation has become reproduction. Okay? And in the Catholic view, they would say that is intrinsically dehumanizing both to the married couple and to the child. I'm not persuaded that it's dehumanizing necessarily to either one of those. So what this also means practically is that the Catholic teaching makes a distinction between technologies that assist normal sex and those that replace it. Excuse me. Okay? So that things like fertility drugs that enable a woman to ovulate regularly are fine. It would also say that this is a little tricky to wrap your arms around, but to be fair, it would also say that technologies like artificial insemination and even gift are okay as long as the sperm is obtained through normal sex. Right? Now, needless to say, that's not the standard of practice for either of those. Right? But it is technically possible to do both of those things and obtain sperm through natural sex. Okay? Now, this 1987 piece was actually written by the current Pope before he assumed that position. It's never proven to separate these different aspects to such a degree, should be to such a degree, as positive to exclude either the procreative intention or the conjugal relation. I think we said last time, this explains why the Catholic Church often gets as exercised about birth control as they do about abortion and about technologically assisted reproduction. because those are two different sides of the same coin. There's just a different violation of that separation, right? Because with abortion birth control, you get this without this. And with technology, you get this without that. Does that make sense? Right? Now, here's how, sorry?
And they take the position that one without the other is dehumanizing, is that correct?
They would say it's dehumanizing to the child and to the couple. They would also say that it's a violation of the intrinsic nature of sexual relations as God designed them. Okay? Now, here's just a couple things to think about. There's actually, I think, a lot to be said for the Catholic view in its simplicity. Because for the Catholic view, IVF is out, donors are out, surrogates are out. There's no circumstance that I can think of under which those might be acceptable.
Embryo adoption.
Embryo adoption, actually, there's a lot of debate about this in Catholic circles, because some acknowledge that it's a genuine rescue, but others are critical of embryo adoption because they say it fosters a cavalier attitude toward the creation of embryos, which, in my view, I think is a little bit overstated. But it certainly runs that risk. But again, in my view, the option of rescuing embryos that are headed down the kitchen sink is a pretty significant trump card, right? But so there is some debate about that. Now, the first thing to think about on this is the phenomena of menopause, which seems to be a natural, I would suggest, God-ordained separation of the unitive and procreative aspects of sex, particularly since the Catholic Church does not support postmenopausal pregnancies. So it seems to me that insisting on an openness to procreation even after menopause, I don't know how you do that. Yeah, of course, my wife's had chemotherapy, she's had her ovaries removed. I suppose we could be open to procreation. But it seems to me just almost kind of silly to think about openness to procreation with a woman who doesn't have any ovaries. I suppose I'm open to something akin to a virgin birth in our family. Possibly this, although that's probably what it would take. Okay. The second part of the thing to think about here is it seems to me that the Scripture treats the unitive end of sex as a sufficient end in itself. And things like the way that the unitive aspect of sex is celebrated in the Song of Solomon is evidence of that. And Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 7, where he urges couples to come together regularly for the unitive component of sex. And remember, the reason for that in the context of 1 Corinthians was so that the individuals in marriage wouldn't be tempted to fulfill those unitive needs outside of marriage, which was, as you know, was rampant in Corinth. That seems also to treat the unitive aspect of sex as sufficient. Right? Now, I think you can also make an argument that what the Catholics accept is a rhythm method of birth control where you're very careful about the woman taking her temperature and figuring out exactly when she's ovulating and avoiding sex during those periods. I think that actually has the same effect, or could have the same effect, of separating the unitive and procreative aspects. Right? Now, I suppose, even in a rhythm method, openness to procreation is all that's required. But that's a little different than what the current pub describes as the procreative intention. Okay? So, I probably wouldn't. I don't think I'd go to the stake with that critique. But I'd want to be careful that the distinction between natural and artificial birth control may be, to use a bad pun, somewhat of an artificial distinction. Or as we say, that may be a distinction without a real difference.
I was just going to say, I mean, couples on birth control can be open to procreation.
Yes, they can.
And it can happen, right? So as long as they're committed to not aborting the baby, it seems like they match along very well with it.
You could. Okay. Now, finally, I would suggest that what Genesis 1 and 2 require is procreation within the sphere of marriage. That we procreate into marriage and out of marriage. Not specifically the specific act of sexual relations. And here I think we need to read Genesis 1 and 2 carefully, and then not be constrained by something that I would consider more a product of the ancient world. It just so happens that there was no other way to conceive children in the ancient world than through normal sex, which explains why surrogacy was the primary way to alleviate infertility. There simply was no technological option. So I guess I'd want to be careful that you don't read in too much to that. That of course, in biblical times, procreation took place within the context of sexual relations. Because there's simply no other option for doing that. But simply because there was no other option available, I'm not sure you can attach any substantial moral significance to that. Does that make sense? No. I'll give you another reference on this if you want to read a little bit more on this. Gilbert Mailander. I think the title of this is neither beasts nor gods, if I recall. Anyway, Mailander he's Protestant, he's Lutheran, but he takes what I would consider to be essentially a Catholic view of this. Now, I don't know that he accepts all the rationale for it, but where he comes out, I think, is basically the same thing. I think the title, Neither Beast Nor Gods.
Neither beast nor God, the dignity of the human person.
Dignity of the human person, yeah. So neither beast nor gods, thank you, the dignity of the human person. It's a short little bit, and it's one of the chapters on procreation in this. But it's probably the best explanation of this view by a non-Catholic.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.